My life has always sought the quiet places, the places where the world's noise collapses, and you can finally hear the sound of your own blood. I grew up with silence as a defining feature, and right after college, when everyone else was desperate for the noise of the city, I went the other way. I convinced my two best friends, Joseph and Maya, to bury ourselves deep in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia for a week. We had the official permits and the standard maps for the well-traveled loops. We were prepared for everything known. But a week before we left, Joseph found the poison. It was a thread buried in the obscure, forgotten corners of the backcountry enthusiast web, a post talking about something called the Old Man's Lookout. It was a rumored fire, spotting tower, completely scrubbed from all official records, after a series of budget cuts in the late 70s. The post claimed the only way to find it was a vague set of coordinates, and an even vaguer, utterly unmaintained trail that branched off our main path. "Imagine the view," Joseph said, holding his phone up, the screen barely showing anything but dark pixels. An untouched 360-degree view, and absolutely no one else knows it exists. Maya, the pragmatist, squinted at the map. "The coordinates put it right in the middle of a blank space, Joseph. A literal void on this Forest Service map. No cell reception, no rangers. If something happens out there, we're waiting a week for a passing hiker." She was right, but the sheer, irresistible lure of a dangerous secret always outweighs the cold logic of risk when you're young and convinced of your own immortality. We compromised. 2 days on the safe loop, establish a solid base camp, and then, if we still had the nerve, we'd try the coordinates with a day pack. The first 2 days were beautiful. We were a machine, Joseph navigating, Maya managing the supplies, and me tending the fire, the flickering, fragile symbol of our human presence. But on the morning of the third day, the knowledge of the secret trail became an unbearable itch. We packed light, water, survival essentials, and the satellite phone, our single, expensive, and fragile tether to the outside. Joseph punched the coordinates into his GPS, and we began the ascent, turning our backs on the familiar safety of the main path. The start of the unmaintained trail was almost invisible, a subtle flattening of the brush. Within 20 minutes, the noise of the main forest didn't just fade. It vanished. The distant rush of the creek, the high-pitched buzz of insects, the faint chatter of other hikers, it was all actively swallowed up by the dense growth, replaced by a deep, oppressive quiet that felt more like a presence than an absence of sound. That's when Maya stopped dead. She pointed to a massive ancient oak, just past where the faint path turned sharply uphill. Tied around the trunk was a strip of bright, fluorescent orange survey tape. "Someone has been here recently," Maya said, her voice flat. "That's not the old, faded stuff. That's fresh, professional." Joseph scoffed, but as we moved deeper, we saw another strip of tape, then another, then a dozen more. Each one was tied at a specific, uniform height and distance, deliberately marking the trail. It wasn't random. It was meticulous. It was systematic. But the Forest Service wouldn't use this hidden area, and it was the wrong color for standard park markers. The curiosity curdled into something else. It was the crushing realization that we weren't pioneers discovering a secret path. We were following a breadcrumb trail, laid out for a specific purpose, and the crumbs hadn't been left for us. The forest felt heavy, the silence now genuinely oppressive. We felt less like we were alone, and more like we were being actively monitored. The markers were spaced precisely 50 yards apart, a chilling pattern. "This is wrong," I finally admitted, my voice weak. "It's too organized, too meticulous." Then we heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was profoundly unnatural. It was a rhythmic, dull thud, far off, muffled by the dense canopy in the distance. It wasn't organic, not thunder, not a tree fall. It sounded metallic, deliberate. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. We stopped dead, listening. The forest held its breath. Every natural sound seemed to vanish in deference to this mechanical intrusion. "What is that?" Joseph whispered, gripping his trekking pole with white knuckles. "It sounds like a heavy hammer," Maya murmured. "Repetitive, methodical." The GPS showed we were barely 200 yards from the lookout. Driven by a morbid, reckless adrenaline, we pressed on. As we crested a ridge, the rhythmic sound abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was not the quiet of deep woods. but an instantaneous, shocking absence of sound, like someone had cut the power to the environment. We waited for a full minute, straining so hard to listen that the blood rushing in our own ears sounded like a roar. Nothing. It's gone, Joseph breathed, a rush of relief hitting his voice. We're almost there. 50 yards later, we broke through a final screen of rhododendrons, and there it was, the old man's lookout. It was a skeletal, 20-foot-tall wooden platform, tilting precariously, forgotten, decaying, and beautiful in its ruin. But the fear wasn't the tower. The true horror was the clearing under the tower. In the small, dirt-packed space, there was a makeshift camp, crude, temporary, and deeply unsettling. There were two things that cemented the true scale of our mistake. First, the fire pit was still smoking, the heat wafting up, meaning whoever had been there had only left moments ago, likely right when the sound stopped, when they heard us approaching the ridge. The contents of the pit were not wood or cooking waste, but scraps of burned plastic and synthetic fabric. Second, and far worse, was a single, faded canvas chair set up 10 feet from the fire pit. It wasn't facing the fire, or the vista, or the tower. It was facing the invisible, unmaintained trail we had just walked in on. It wasn't a chair for relaxing. It was a chair for watching. We had followed a perimeter, marked by orange tape, right into the sightline of a silent observer. We hadn't stumbled into an empty place. We had walked straight into a trap, and the owner was now just outside the boundaries of our sight, watching us stand exactly where he wanted us to be. "We need to go. Now," Joseph choked out. Maya, the calm one, was shaking her head slowly. "No, they know the only way out is back the way we came. That's a planned ambush. We need to go off the trail, straight through the woods, away from their markers." We were trapped. The debate lasted maybe 20 seconds, each tick of the clock amplifying the horrifying knowledge that someone was out there, their eyes fixed on the small, exposed clearing. "Ambush or lost," Joseph whispered. "I'd rather be lost than caught." Maya was already moving, not toward the trail, but heading directly down the steepest, densest part of the hill, consulting her compass. "The main creek is southwest. We follow the fall line. Move." We plunged into the undergrowth. It was brutal. Every step was a battle against thorny bushes and tangled roots, but the pain was secondary to the psychological pressure. Every snapping twig behind us, every rush of wind through the branches, was no longer nature. It was the sound of a silent, inevitable pursuit. After 100 yards, I stopped, gasping. Joseph skidded to a stop next to me. I can't hear anything," I panted. Maya, however, was already a few feet ahead, examining the base of a huge boulder. She crouched down, her expression a mask of pure, cold dread. "Look," she breathed, pointing. At the base of the boulder, tucked into the damp moss, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was about the size of my thumb, made of a dark wood, and it was nestled so perfectly that you would only see it if you were looking directly down at that exact spot. But what made my stomach clench was the material tied around the bird's neck. Another strip of the same fluorescent orange survey tape. This wasn't a marker for a trail. This was a marker for us. It wasn't a professional operation. This was personal, artistic, and deliberate. It felt like a note left by a psychopath, a souvenir to let us know we were seen, and that he had time to carve a tiny toy while watching us struggle. The fear transitioned into unadulterated panic. We didn't exchange another word. We just ran again, our movements purely instinctual, until we finally heard the glorious, crashing roar of the creek, a guaranteed, known landmark. We collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping. The creek was a highway. It led to civilization, but it was also a perfect, straight line for a determined pursuer. "Sat phone," Maya choked out. "We call the Rangers. Now." Joseph fumbled with the bulky phone, extending the antenna. It chirped, showing a flickering bar of signal enough for an emergency call. As he frantically dialed, I happened to look across the creek, up the steep, opposing bank. The bank was a wall of tangled mountain laurel and pine, and then I saw it. Not clearly, not like a figure walking in the open. It was a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the texture of the green wall. A patch of the laurel, perhaps 10 feet up the opposing bank, was just a little too dark, a little too still. It was a human silhouette, perfectly motionless, perfectly hidden, using the dense foliage as a living screen. I didn't yell. I couldn't. The fear froze the sound in my throat, that primal realization that the hunter was watching his prey rest. "Joseph," I managed. The word a dry, cracked whisper. "Stop. Don't call." Joseph didn't look up. "What?" "It's connecting." "Across the creek," I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Don't move your head. Just look. In the laurel. He's there." Joseph slowly, agonizingly, shifted his eyes. He saw it too. The perfectly still, hidden shape. The terrifying realization was this: if we called the rangers and spoke into the satellite phone, we would be confirming that we saw him and that we were calling for help. We would be declaring open war, and we were unarmed and exposed. But if we didn't call, he would watch us move downstream, assuming we were just lost hikers taking a break, hoping we would wander back into his territory. I slowly stood up, holding my breath, forcing my face into an expression of frustrated exhaustion, the picture of a hiker who'd had a bad day. I looked right at the silhouette with a vacant stare, and then deliberately turned my back on it. "The phone is dead," I lied, projecting my voice slightly down the creek. "No signal. It's useless. Let's just follow the creek back to the main trail. It's the only way." We walked away from the creek bank, downstream, moving with a forced, casual pace that masked the frantic, bone-chilling terror in our minds. Every step was a performance to convince the silent, hidden watcher that we were just lost, defeated hikers, not witnesses trying to escape. We never saw the figure move. We never heard a sound. But for the next 4 miles, until we hit the glorious, crowded noise of the main hiking loop, I felt the phantom pressure of eyes on my back, watching every painful step. We made it back to our base camp near midnight, exhausted and emotionally shattered. We broke camp in a frenzy, leaving behind a full bag of unused food and supplies. The idea of staying another hour in that part of the forest was unbearable. We drove out of Monongahela before the sun even rose. We never reported what happened. The thought of telling a ranger that a guy with an unsettling camp and a wooden bird was watching us felt weak and paranoid. Joseph, the skeptic, was silent for the entire 12-hour drive home. Maya, the calm thinker, developed a nervous tic in her left eye that wouldn't go away for weeks. To this day, I can't look at a piece of fluorescent orange without feeling a visceral surge of adrenaline. The worst part isn't the fear of what he might have done to us. The true psychological horror is the realization of what he was doing. He was just observing. We didn't interrupt a crime or a secret operation. We interrupted a man who was using the deepest, most remote part of the forest not to hide from the world, but to watch, in clinical detail, the rare people who entered it. He wanted to see us struggle, to see our panic, to watch us break, and then to let us go a chilling, personal, and profoundly sick experiment with the human psyche. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I see that small, hand-carved wooden bird, tied with a bright orange piece of plastic, a tiny, perfect piece of art left for me to find. A chilling souvenir from the man who was watching. And I realize, with a cold certainty that hasn't left me, that we were never truly lost that day. We were found, and he knows exactly who found his trail. My name is Castor, and for 3 years, I chose one of the most remote, punishing work environments on the planet, the offshore oil rig. The money was incredible, but the isolation was a unique torture. You are suspended on a steel island hundreds of miles from land, utterly alone, surrounded by the perfect, featureless, 360-degree prison of the North Sea. The mind starts to do strange, fragile things in that unending blue void. The rig I was on, the Midas, was an older semi-submersible, a brutalist structure far out past the Shetland Islands. My job was communications technician, and I often worked alone, late at night, in a little windowless cinderblock room called the Brain, the hub for all the rig's networks and cameras. My night shift colleagues were Marcus, a towering, superstitious roughneck, who saw bad omens in everything, and Finn, a grizzled, quiet Welsh mechanic, the true skeptic who thought the only terror on the rig was the corporate safety inspector. The whole thing started on my second week into a rotation, around 2 a.m. I was in the Brain, running diagnostics, when the rig's entire internal CCTV network glitched. All hundreds of camera eyes went down for about 3 seconds, then flickered back on. Not unusual, but unsettling. When the systems rebooted, I noticed a change on one of the monitors, the CCTV feed for the supply boat loading bay. The bay was a large, floodlit deck section, mostly empty between supply runs, facing the open water. And on that deck, right next to the enormous winch gear, was a shape. It wasn't a shadow. It was too solid, too low to the ground. It looked like a hunched-over person, wearing heavy, dark gear, crouched next to a stack of empty pallets. My mouth went dry. I checked the manifest. No one was scheduled to be on that deck. It was sealed for the night with a zero-tolerance policy. I pulled up the recorded footage. The glitch had happened about 5 minutes ago. Before the glitch, the deck was empty. When the system came back up, the figure was there. I called the deck boss, Henderson. He was immediately annoyed. Deck 4 has been sealed since 10 p.m., Caster. Could be a shadow. It's not a shadow, sir. It's too distinct. Dark gear, maybe a backpack. I'm sending you a still. I saved the image and pinged it. Before I could hang up, Henderson's voice came back, no longer annoyed, but sharp and tense. Stay put. Do not leave the comms room. I'm calling security. Just as he hung up, the figure on the screen moved. It didn't stand up. It just shifted its weight, slowly, deliberately, and began to crawl, not toward the nearest ladder, but toward the dark railing of the rig, the sheer, crushing drop into the North Sea. 10 minutes later, Henderson and a security guard cautiously approached the loading bay in the camera feed. They moved with a military precision that was deeply unsettling. They reached the bay. The area where the figure had been was empty. The guard swept the area with a powerful flashlight. Then, the light lingered, and the guard and Henderson looked at each other with identical expressions of bewildered dread. The security guard knelt down and picked something up off the steel deck. I zoomed in. The guard was holding a small piece of dark, synthetic fabric. A scrap, maybe 6 inches across, tucked into a corner of the winch housing. It was small, but it was wrong. It was too new, too clean, and it didn't belong to the rig or any of our gear. Henderson radioed back, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Caster, run the cameras on a loop, full speed. Show me the moment they disappeared. I fast-forwarded the last few minutes. I watched the crouched figure again. It crawled to the railing, reached the edge, and then, right on the periphery of the frame, it just sank. It didn't jump over the edge. It simply seemed to compress itself, falling below the line of sight and disappearing into the ocean's blackness. There was no splash, no sound. But the most disturbing detail came when I ran the loop backwards, starting from when Henderson and the guard arrived. As I rewound the footage, the figure didn't reappear from the ocean, as a stowaway who had climbed up would have. Instead, the figure appeared from the floor of the bay. I watched it manifest, not as a rapid emergence, but as a slow, impossible reverse motion of something unfolding from beneath the steel plating of the deck itself, near the drainage grates. It was as if it was pushing itself up from inside the rig's structure. I sent the clip. Henderson called back, his voice a strained whisper. Caster, we are running a full, silent muster. We are not calling the Coast Guard. Do not talk about what you saw to anyone. Not a single person. He wasn't worried about a stowaway anymore. He was terrified of the PR nightmare of a security lapse hundreds of miles offshore. That's the real horror of a corporate world. They fear the loss of profit more than the loss of life. I was trapped in a tiny, windowless room, connected to hundreds of cameras, watching a massive steel structure in the middle of a black ocean, with the knowledge that something physically impossible, was moving within the rig. The silent muster produced nothing. Every member of the crew was accounted for, all 110 souls. As the morning watch dragged on, I started seeing the impossible again. On a camera feed monitoring a maintenance corridor on Deck 2, a narrow, dimly lit tube of steel, I saw a flicker. The camera's frame rate seemed to drop for a split second, and in that momentary blur, a shape moved from one shadow to the next. This time, it wasn't a crawl. It was an unnervingly fast, low-slung scuttle, like a crab or a monstrous insect, moving from a drain duct near the floor to a section of access panels. The movement was so unnatural, so fluid and quick, that it defied human anatomy. It was too low, too fast, and too wrong. I immediately zoomed in. Nothing, just an empty, humming corridor. But when I checked the footage again, I saw something that made me physically recoil. Where the figure had paused, on the metal of the access panel, there was a momentary, shimmering reflection. It wasn't the reflection of the corridor light. It was the distorted, slick reflection of a surface, that looked wet, almost oily. And it was gone as soon as it appeared, absorbed back into the matte gray of the steel. I called Henderson, my voice barely a croak. "Deck 2, West Corridor. 10 seconds ago." It was inhuman. Henderson dismissed me. "A hallucination, Caster. You've been staring at those screens for too long. Get some coffee." They were in denial, but I was the one with the eyes, and I knew what I saw. I felt my sanity slipping, trapped in a steel box, with something alien and predatory sharing the air. At 5:30 a.m., the alarms went off. Not the fire or drill alarms, but the emergency pressure alarm for the ballast tanks, the enormous sea-filled chambers deep inside the rig that kept it stable. An instant later, the rig lurched. It was a slight movement, but I felt it instantly in the core of the structure. The rig was tilting, and in the North Sea, that was a death sentence. I ran the diagnostics. The report that flooded my screen was horrifying. Several of the ballast tank doors were open, manually overridden from the inside. The rig was taking on water at an alarming rate. Sabotage. The saboteur was inside. I frantically checked the drilling floor CCTV feed. I remembered the last person I had put there. Marcus, the overreactor. Marcus was there, but he wasn't working. He was standing alone, his back to the camera, looking at a stack of heavy, sealed crates. He was absolutely still. Then, slowly, he reached out a hand to one of the crates. His hand stopped an inch away, and his fingers began to contort. They were bending backward, then forward, moving in a grotesque, impossible ballet of broken bone. It wasn't Marcus moving his hand. It was the presence of an unseen pressure around his hand, squeezing it, forcing it to bend in unnatural ways. And then I saw the dark shape, the same one from the loading bay, only this time on the massive steel plating of the drilling floor. It wasn't a person. It was a flattened, slick, segmented shape, like a monstrously large sea creature that had somehow adapted to move on land, and it was rising. It was unfolding itself from the floor, moving with a slick, black, oily sheen. And the piece of fabric the guard had picked up? It wasn't a scrap of gear. It was a shed piece of the creature's own skin, or shell. It was molting, growing, and using the rig's internal structure as its own hive. Marcus suddenly screamed a high, piercing sound of pure terror that cut through the rig's industrial roar. The creature, or thing, was too close now. It was huge, a segmented, slick mass of organic armor, and it was engulfing Marcus's arm. I couldn't just watch. I grabbed the rig's intercom microphone, my voice shaking so badly I could barely speak, and I bypassed the local channels, broadcasting to every deck, every speaker, every common area on the Midas. "Emergency! This is Caster in the brain. All hands on deck. Ballast tanks are open. Sabotage on deck 2. This is not a drill. Something is on the rig. Something is not human. Get to the muster stations now. Seal all internal doors." The sound of my voice, raw and panicked, echoed through the internal speakers, a scream of truth against the corporate silence. I watched as the lights on the drilling floor flickered. The monstrous, slick shape enveloping Marcus paused, its attention drawn not to its prey, but to the sound of my broadcast, the sound of the entire crew being alerted. I had ruined its chance for a silent takeover. In that instant, as the shape turned its attention from Marcus's slowly crushed arm to the camera that transmitted my voice, I felt a horrifying, primal, shared intelligence connect with me through the feed. A wave of pure, cold hatred radiated from the screen, and I knew it knew exactly where I was. Chaos broke out on the rig. The crew managed to get the ballast tank sealed, the rig stabilized, and a full search was conducted under the light of a new, terrifying reality. They never found Marcus. The security detail found his safety helmet near the stack of crates, but nothing else. No blood, no body, no sign of a struggle, only a strange, slick, clear residue on the steel deck where he had been standing. The official story was a tragic man-overboard incident, a lie they kept repeating to the media and the Coast Guard. I told my story. I showed the videos. Finn, the skeptic, who had seen the slick residue, backed me up, but Henderson, terrified of the liability, had me flown back to the mainland for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. I was fired, of course, paid out in full, and made to sign an aggressive NDA. They framed the incident as a stress-induced hallucination caused by the extreme isolation, but the psychological horror didn't end. I am on land now, hundreds of miles from the North Sea. But I still work in IT. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm running a system update on a server rack, a sealed, cool, dark metal box, I hear the soft, faint, slick scuttling sound coming from deep inside the casing. I realize that the oil rigs aren't just platforms for extracting crude oil from the earth. They are enormous, isolated, perfect metal islands, miles away from human help, where something dark, hungry, and impossibly patient has found a perfect, remote ecosystem to thrive, to grow, and to wait for the next shipment of human beings. And I was the one who broadcast the entire world's attention to its feeding ground. For 2 years after I dropped out of university, my life was defined by the kind of dead-end job that puts you in impossible, forgotten places. The last one I took was the strangest, the one that still makes my palms sweat. Relief driver for a long-haul trucking company specializing in remote logistical transport. We delivered specialized, high-security equipment to deep country research labs and isolated mining operations. This time, our destination was a nearly defunct, privately owned radio telescope array in the middle of the Nevada desert. My co-driver was Sal, a grizzled Vietnam veteran, the ultimate skeptic. He had seen everything and believed nothing, except for the absolute necessity of a rigid schedule. My third supporting character was Carol, the dispatcher. She was never physically with us, but her voice was a constant, soothing lifeline over the crackling satellite radio, navigating the terrifying boredom of the road. The job was simple: drive a specialized, temperature-controlled trailer from Albuquerque to a location marked on our antiquated GPS unit as NV04ECH OGRIDZERO. The last 150 miles were on an unmaintained dirt road, a ribbon of crushed stone slicing through the absolute desolation of a restricted military area periphery. We started the last leg at dusk. The desert sunset was a massive, fiery, spectacular blaze, but as the light vanished, the landscape turned into a study of black and shadow. The silence outside the cab was so complete, it was a physical weight. The only sound was the deep, monotonous rumble of the diesel engine. Sal, chewing on a cold cigar, looked at the GPS unit. 30 miles, kid. Don't worry, the desert's quiet this time of year. Nothing out here but dust and bad dreams. I laughed, trying to match his casual confidence, but I was feeling the familiar prickle of being watched. The road was straight, but the darkness was textured, full of shapes that moved in the periphery of my headlights. Then, we lost the road. The GPS unit, which had been reliable for 1,200 miles, suddenly flickered and went dark. Simultaneously, the entire bank of electronics in the cab, the standard radio, the tablet, even the engine diagnostics display shut off. We were 20 tons of metal, blinded by the darkness, with only the beams of the headlights cutting through the void. "What the hell was that?" I stammered, gripping the wheel. Sal, ever the pragmatist, immediately pulled over. "EMP pulse," he said, already checking fuses. "It's the desert. Military exercise. They fry the grid to keep us out. We'll wait 10 minutes. We sat in the suffocating silence. The air conditioning was off, and the heat in the cab was immediate and oppressive. The darkness outside was so deep it felt like a physical entity. We were literally the only source of light for 100 square miles. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. 30 minutes passed. Still nothing. The engine, thankfully, was still running a purely mechanical beast, unaffected by whatever had killed the electronics. Sal got back in the driver's seat. "Screw it, we've got paper maps. The telescope is at the end. We're driving on faith. Get on the satellite phone and tell Carol we're off the grid, but we're moving." I picked up the heavy-duty satellite phone, our single, battery-powered lifeline. I extended the antenna, checked the power, and tried to dial. Nothing. The screen just displayed, "No service. Check antenna." The EMP must have been stronger than Sal thought. Our only communication was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the engine and the low, tense silence between us. We drove for another hour, guided only by the paper map and the terrifying logic of the road keep driving. The road was getting worse, washboarded and punishing. Then, through the dust and the dark, the lights of the station appeared. It wasn't a beacon of hope, it was a scene of deep psychological unease. The radio telescope was enormous, a massive white saucer tilted toward the sky. The surrounding complex wasn't fully dark, but the lights were sporadic and weak. A single, flickering lamp over a chain-link fence, and a few dim yellow squares of light from the main office block. We pulled up to the main gate, a heavy, rusting chain-link monstrosity with a sign that simply read, NV04ECHO. Entry restricted. Call ahead. The gate was closed, and there was no guard in the small hut next to it. No movement, no sign of life. The drop-off was supposed to be a 24-hour guarded facility. Sal honked the horn, a loud, abrasive bellow that seemed to vanish instantly into the void. We waited. No response. He did it again. Silence. They should have been watching for our lights, I muttered. Well, maybe they're just deep in a breakthrough, Sal grumbled, climbing out of the cab with a heavy flashlight. I'm not waiting here all night. The contract says we deliver. I'll cut the chain. I watched him walk toward the fence, his flashlight beam wavering. As he approached the gate, I looked up at the main telescope dish, the massive saucer pointing to the silent, star-packed sky. And that's when I saw it. On the rim of the dish, at the very top, silhouetted against the wash of the Milky Way, there was a figure. Small, thin, and absolutely motionless. It looked like a maintenance worker standing on the catwalk, but it was too still, too isolated. Sal, I called out, my voice tight. Wait. Look up. On the dish. Sal followed my gaze. His light beam, trained on the massive dish, picked out the figure. It was definitely human-shaped, but it was just standing. Watching. Must be the night guy, Sal said, shrugging off the anxiety radiating from me, waiting for us to announce ourselves. They're probably just out of comms, too. He turned back to the gate, pulling a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters from his toolbox. The sound of the cutters snapping the heavy steel chain was like a gunshot in the silence. As the chain fell, I watched the figure on the rim of the dish. It moved. Not much. Just a slight shift of its weight, a small, slow movement that confirmed it was watching us. But the movement wasn't what seized me with dread. It was the realization that the man on the dish was standing right where the feed horn, the central, high-frequency focus of the entire telescope, was located. That area was bathed in lethal microwave radiation. No one stood there for more than a few minutes, even in a protective suit. He's not a maintenance worker, I whispered. He's just standing there, like a statue. Sal was already pushing the gate open. Get back in the cab, kid. We're delivering this payload and getting the hell out of here. The psychological fear now was a chilling cocktail of isolation, lack of communication, and the unnerving realization that the people we were delivering to were either gone or had succumbed to something deeply wrong. We were driving into a trap set by a silent, watching entity in the middle of a military-controlled no-man's land. We drove the massive truck slowly through the compound. We pulled up to the unloading bay, a darkened, hangar-like structure. The delivery manifest required a signature and a visual inspection by a qualified receiver, but there was no one there. Sal, visibly frustrated, checked the back of the hangar. No one. The place is running, but no one's home. Let's look for the main office. We walked side by side toward the main office block. Sal found an unlocked side door and pushed it open. The smell that hit us was the first thing that broke his cool demeanor. It wasn't the smell of a forgotten building, but a faint, metallic odor, like ozone and dried blood, overlaid with the sterile, chemical smell of cleaning product. The office was a maze of darkened rooms. Everything was orderly. Desks were clean, monitors were off, and personal items were still sitting out. A coffee mug, a family photo, a half-eaten granola bar. It was as if everyone had stood up and walked away mid-sentence. We eventually found the main control room, a massive, circular room lined with workstations, all dark, save for a single, small monitor on the lead scientist's desk. The screen was displaying a static image, a plain text file, half-written, the log of the last hour of operation. I leaned over and read it out loud. 23-7, anomaly detected on Sector 14, Gamma, faint but distinct, not terrestrial, not recognized by database. Source is too close. 23-15. Increased power to receiving array. Running diagnostic on interference. Sound is complex. Not noise. Not signal. It is a language composed of pure, sustained frequency. 2325. The noise is causing physical symptoms. Pressure headache, nausea. Dr. Alvis is exhibiting extreme photophobia. We are turning down the gain. 2340. It is speaking to us. Not through the comms. It is in the dish. It is resonating through the structure. It wants us to listen. 2355. It is beautiful. The language is pure. It is undoing the structure of my thoughts. I understand why they built the telescope this far out. Not to find something, but to contain it. The log ended there. The time was 11:55 p.m., right around the time our electronics had fried and we lost the road. Sal stood there, reading the words over my shoulder, his skepticism finally cracking. Not terrestrial, not noise, it's a language. He looked at me, his eyes wide and panicked. They weren't trying to hear the stars, kid. They were listening to something they knew was out here, and they were driven insane by it. The terror of the empty, silent facility was replaced by a deeper, existential horror. We were dealing with the aftermath of an encounter with something profoundly alien. Something that communicated through a medium that literally broke the human mind. The figure on the dish wasn't a guard. It was the last researcher, mesmerized, waiting for the full transmission. And then, a sound. It came from the main antenna dish. A sound so low that it was below the threshold of human hearing, but it vibrated through the steel and concrete of the control room. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in the bones. It was a deep, resonant hum, a pure, sustained frequency that felt like a tuning fork vibrating on my teeth. Simultaneously, the small monitor on the desk flickered. The black text disappeared, replaced by a single, impossible word, flashing in a sickening, luminescent green. Heard. The word wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. We had heard it. Sal reacted first. The calm pragmatist was gone, replaced by a man running on pure adrenaline and guilt. The truck! We have to get out. It's still in the dish. We bolted out of the control room, back through the darkened offices and into the night. We scrambled back into the cab. The old diesel engine roared to life, a glorious, earthbound sound of mechanical defiance. As I jammed the truck into reverse, I looked back at the massive radio dish. The silent figure on the rim was gone, but on the vast, white, parabolic surface of the dish itself, I saw them. They weren't a cohesive shape. They were impressions, shadows of movement that seemed to slide across the smooth white surface, a series of dark, oily-looking vertical streaks, like rain on a window, only moving up the curve of the dish, toward the feed horn. It was a mass of segmented, writhing shapes, responding to the low, bone-vibrating hum, gathering themselves, preparing for another transmission or for an arrival. And then, one of the streaks stopped. It coalesced into a dense, vertical mass on the side of the dish, and it was looking directly at our headlights. I could feel the cold, crushing weight of an intelligence vast, non-human, and deeply curious, focused entirely on the massive metal box we were driving, the box that held the specialized equipment they had been waiting for. I mashed the accelerator, throwing the huge truck into a violent turn, tearing through the main gate, leaving the snap chain lying in the dust. We drove for 6 straight hours on the dirt road, never slowing down. The only sound the violent rattle of the truck and our ragged breathing. The electronics didn't come back on until we hit the main state highway, 200 miles away. The satellite phone instantly buzzed to life. Carol, the comm dispatcher, was frantic. Alex, Sal, what happened? You dropped off the map. I've been trying to call you for 6 hours. Sal, staring straight ahead at the rising sun, answered, his voice flat and dead. The payload is delivered, Carol. Signed for. Everything is fine. Log us out. We're coming home. We never told her the truth. We created a cover story, a flash flood, a disabled truck, and a lost night waiting for a signal. I was fired for violating the communications failure protocol, but I didn't care. The truth is, I don't fear the dark or the isolation. My fear is a psychological one, the deep, cold certainty that I know the real reason the place was so remote. The telescope array wasn't built to listen to the distant stars. It was built as a cage for a specific piece of the sky, a terrifyingly close, silent, pure frequency. And now, when I'm alone, late at night, I sometimes get a low-frequency hum in my ears. It's too low to be heard, but I feel it in the center of my skull, a deep, resonant vibration. And in the oppressive silence, When I least expect it, I hear a single, resonant, telepathic word: heard. Whatever intelligence came from the sky that night didn't leave empty-handed. It left us alone, but it followed us home, a silent, listening passenger in our minds. And it is still waiting for the next truck full of curious humans to deliver its newest, most necessary equipment.